Right, let's transition to the first part of the show. I want to take a slightly different tact. And I mentioned at the top of the show in the introduction that there was a series of things that have happened overnight. I mentioned that there was a plane crash in Colombia, and then the Australian police tasered a 95-year-old woman. And we see these types of news stories all the time. We see these things happen all the time. So I want to talk about the plane crash in Colombia. It was a light plane, and when you read the reports, it keeps saying that there was 7 people on the plane, and they think that 4 of the kids survived. There was a bit of a false start there where the Colombian president came out and said, they've survived, we found them. And because they'd been in the bush for, I think it was like 2 weeks or something like that. It was quite a while. And they said that the pilot was killed in the plane crash, and then there was 3 other adults on there as well that were also killed, but the 4 kids survived, and they'd survived in the bush on their own. And they keep referring to these people that were in the plane crash as indigenous. So that's the thing that kind of piqued my interest, right? So if you're an indigenous kid in Colombia and you're used to growing up in the jungle, suddenly you're in an airplane, and then suddenly you're not, you're on the ground for one reason or another. You're used to being in the jungle. You're used to surviving.
Hold on. I don't mean to interrupt. But I mean, at 18 months old, how much survival skills can you have in the wild?
Well, there was a 13-year-old, a 9-year-old, 7-year-old, and an 18-month-old. So the bigger kid's probably looking after the little kid, right? So 100%, you're 100% right there. So that helpless little child is not doing anything. The point that I'm trying to make here is the point that I want to make here as well, and it ties into the police story as well, is that you never, ever in your life rise to an occasion. You won't. What you do is you sink to the level of your training. And that's something that is taught to you in the military. And it's unfortunately, for whatever reason, it's not taught to you in life. It's one of those unspoken truths of how you exist in the world. And so if I just kind of pull on that thread there, and tell me what you think here, Ed, because I want to take a different tack with the show today and not talk about a war, is that if you're in a plane crash, but you're an indigenous kid and you're used to living in the bush, because that's where you live and that's just kind of how your life is. If you're suddenly in the air and then, the next minute you're on the ground and the people around you have died, well, yeah, that's pretty tragic. That's not something you experience every day. There's no occasion to rise to there. But if you're suddenly found, you have to build a shelter, and then you have to find some water, and then what are we going to eat? And I'm sure that they had some of those supplies and some of those things on the airplane as well that they probably could have recovered. If they survived, then the plane probably didn't explode and blow up into flames and whatnot. So we don't really know the full story. It came out that they were found, and then the president had to retract his statement and his comment by saying, well, hang on, it's a bit of a false start. We're not sure. We think we found them. We haven't found them. We think we found them. So they haven't quite got there just yet. Either way, whether the kids are alive or they're not, it made me think you don't rise to the occasion. And it made me think if I was in a plane crash in the Amazon jungle and I was 2 weeks away from a rescue, would I survive? The short answer is probably not, because I don't have the skills. I'm not equipped with the skills to try and find water, to build a shelter. Well, I could probably build a shelter. That's probably not really an issue. But then how are you going to survive? What are you going to eat? Yeah, well, I can live up to 30 to 40 days without eating anything, but it's going to get really, really hard really, really quickly. And then it kind of dawned upon me, like, as a pilot and an aviator in flying in general aviation, you read a lot about what to do if your plane goes down. Particularly, as soon as I take off from Bankstown Airport and fly for 20 minutes to the west of Sydney, I'm over the Great Dividing Range and I'm over the scrub. And if my airplane goes down there, you just won't be seen. So you're on your own in that part of the world. And I've got some pretty good survival skills and survival techniques, and I've done a lot of reading, and I was in the military, and I think I'd be okay in this part of the world. But in the jungle, in the Amazon, I don't think so. So anyway, I was reading the story and I found it was really interesting and it was pretty cool. And then I was looking at the next story where it says an Australian police officer has tasered a 95-year-old woman. So the cops get a call, and the call is, there's a woman in the nursing home and she's wielding a knife. She has dementia. And the police come in and they're like lunging at her with a knife. Look, I wasn't there. I can't say, right? But what I can say with absolute certainty from the photos that I've seen, and if I show you the pictures, you'll kind of agree with me there, is that if you look at this, woman, she is a frail old lady, and there's absolutely no way that you would need to actually use a taser. You could use a baton, you could use a broomstick. There's 1,000 things that you could use. And they tasered the woman twice to make her drop the weapon. She fell down and hit her head, and now she's fighting for her life. So what that says to me is that the police that turn up to a job like this have never been trained in a situation like this. And look, being a police officer is probably by far, in my view anyway, the hardest job on planet Earth. I don't think that there's any job that would be any more difficult than being a police officer. Going to domestic violence, dealing with car accidents, dealing with death and destruction all day long. And they choose to do it, right? And it's such a traumatic job. What I'm trying to say is, amongst all of that trauma and that chaos and all the things that those people deal with on a daily basis, they'd never been dealt with a scenario where there's an old 95-year-old woman with a knife lunging at them. So they pull their taser out and then they give her a couple like that. It seems really, really strange to me. And I just want to let the audience know, and I want to share this with the audience because it's been my experience in my life that you never rise to the occasion ever. You know, you hear about a car backing out and running over a 2-year-old child on their push bike, and the mother gets out and lifts up the car and pulls the kid out from under the car. Yeah, maybe there's an adrenaline thing that happens there for those things to actually happen. But when it comes to a situation like we're talking about with this woman with a knife and the police with a taser, or this plane crash with the kids and them being able to survive, predominantly 99.9% of your life, you're never going to rise to an occasion. You're only ever going to fall to the level of your training. So it begs the question, and it's the conversation that I was kind of having with myself. Are you really ready? Are you really ready for what life throws at you? And a couple of weeks ago, I was down the park and I was doing some chin-ups like I do in a chin-up workout, and it was a bit wet on the bars and stuff, and I had some chalk on my hands, and I took my shirt off and I wiped the bar. I wiped all the water off the bar, but it was still wet and it was a bit dewy, and I had the chalk on my hands, and I started doing my workout, and I must have done about 50 or 60 chin-ups, I don't know. There's a couple of sets or something like that. I wasn't really counting, right? I was just kind of going for time. And I looked at my hands, and my hands were like really hurting, and I got on a bar and did another set. And because the bar was wet, my skin was soft, and then the chalk was stopping me move, and I tore all my hands up. And I was like this. And anyway, when I got home, Susie says to me, how was your workout? And I'm like, look, and I showed her my hands, and she's like, my God, what are you doing? What are you doing, Fierce? What are you even training for? What's wrong with you? Like, she's getting upset with me, right? And she says, what are you training for? And I thought, everything. I'm training for everything. Every possible scenario that life could throw at me. And, I want to ask you, Ed, are you ready? Are you ready for anything? Are you ready for everything? Because in some ways I read these news stories and I go, no, I'm not. But I want to be, and I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be a better version of myself.
Yeah, well, I think I'm actually ready for quite a bit, but I'll rely more on my wits than I will on physical prowess. But I want to ask you, I've heard stories about you when you're in the Navy being thrown over the side of the ship, and then the ship going away saying, "Oh, we'll come back for you someday," and your job, you have to survive in the water until the ship comes back for you, right? I remember that story.
Not quite. There's if a man goes over the side of the ship, or a woman, so you do a man overboard drill. So the ship is steaming along in a given direction. So say it's tracking north, so it's going straight up north like that. There's a lifebuoy sentry that sits on the back of the ship when you're underway. And what they'll do is they've got a dummy, and when you're on a warship, you wear it like overalls, yeah. And the dummy has got two spent shells in its legs, so it sits down and it's got a life jacket on. And they huck the dummy over the side to make sure that the lifebuoy sentry is doing what they're doing. And he's like, "Oh my God!" Boom. And it looks like a person in the water. Yeah, you'd be forgiven for thinking.
Yeah, but didn't you have survival training while you were in the service? You must have. It must have been.
You would think, right? You'd think, not really, not especially in the Navy, right? So in the Navy, the survival training that you do is that your son was in the Navy. I bet you he would say something similar, right? Because the training would be similar. At recruit school, they So if you go over the side of the ship, like if the ship was hit by a missile or the ship was sunk, you're in the life raft, and there's these big life rafts. You would have seen them before. That probably fits about 10 or 12 people in it, and they capsize the life raft, and you got to stand on the top of it and get in. Then you got to get inside it. Then they leave you in the life raft all day, and you get a little bit seasick, and there's no water. You're really thirsty, and then everybody's like getting on each other's nerves after about like 20 minutes. So imagine if you're in the water like that for hours at a time, or days or weeks at a time. The train, you can't really simulate those things. It's very hard to simulate something like that. And even if you could simulate it, you still know that it's a training exercise. So
well, we have a show here called The Office. I don't know whether you've ever seen it,
Yeah.
but there's an episode with Michael Scott where he goes out in the wilderness and he survives for the episode, and he gets some really good survival tips. You just watch that episode, and you should be halfway there. Man,
that's all you need, right? Yeah. Have you seen the TV show called Alone?
I haven't seen Alone. I've seen Naked. Is that Naked and Alone, or Naked?
No, it's just Alone, and it's just a bunch of. It's like a reality show, right? It's the shittest idea for a reality show you've ever seen, right? Because what they do is go, all right, you go out in the scrub and see how long you can survive.